Leslie Weinstein, and this is DIB Tech Talk, a show where we make sense of all things cybersecurity for the defense industrial base. In this series, I'll introduce you to cybersecurity concepts and industry experts. I'll also review innovative products and solutions to help you implement and manage your cybersecurity program. Let's dig right in. Thank you so much for joining me on today's special episode of DIB Tech Talk. Normally, I would do a news introduction, and then I would interview a guest, and then I would close the show with some closing remarks. But because this is a special episode, and because the interim rule has gone into effect this week, I think it's important to put out something a little unique. Today, my guest is Stuart. And I'm going to interview Stuart. We're going to have a chat, and then I'm going to play for you guys an interview that I had with Doug Cherry, who works for a small business in supply chain, and he's going to highlight some of the topics and issues that he's facing that Stuart and I are about to tee up for you guys today. So Stuart is an industry expert. He's a supply chain, cybersecurity, and risk management expert. So Stuart, can you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about how you play in this field?
Yeah, I had the advantage of being involved in supply chain very early in the automation of supply chain, and initiatives like Just in Time came in to introduce automatic identification technology, things like barcoding and RFID. And over time, as things became more sophisticated, software evolved. It certainly created a whole new set of risks and concerns to be involved with. And I've had the good opportunity to kind of live through that and be involved in solving some of those problems, or at least watching those and sitting next to those that have solved them. And it's given me a really special understanding, I think, of a lot of the challenges we're facing today and where those challenges have come from. I also had the opportunity to be deeply involved with the defense industrial base through the time I spent with ExoStar as vice president for products and for marketing. And ExoStar, which had been until recently a joint venture owned by 5 very large defense contractors, certainly enjoyed a unique position within the defense industrial base, and the privilege not only to work with the prime contractors, but to work with a substantial portion of those companies that supplied to all of those defense contractors.
Yeah, and so I want to, so until I started working for OUSD A&S a few years ago, and before I started my MBA, I didn't really understand supply chain. Like, I understand that, suppliers have suppliers, but I never really thought about it more than that. Can you talk about the importance and what it means for supply chain to be resilient, for supply chain to be secure, for supply chain? Like, why is it important that the DoD harden its supply chain? And what does that actually mean? Like, what does resiliency mean in supply chain?
Well, I think, effectively it ensures that the supply chain is able to operate and even self-correct in the event of any type of an adverse reaction. Think of something that could occur, just an environmental issue, a storm that may threaten the ability of goods to ship from one part of the country to another, or one part of the world to another, and having the means to be able to make adjustments to ensure that the ability to deliver goods and services is not interrupted. And within the DoD supply chain, the DoD supply chain is quite deep when you look at the number of organizations that not just contract, but those that supply the contractors and the many tiers that are involved. The resilience is really dependent on every single step within the supply chain, those at the very bottom. And we tend to focus on those as small organizations, but they tend to be organizations sometimes that have very highly specialized, unique capabilities and skills. And their unavailability would have a huge impact on the resilience of the overall supply chain.
Yeah. So how does that apply to national security? Like, why do we talk about, when we talk about the CMMC and NIST, why does that like immediately get an arrow drawn towards national security? Can you link those two together?
Well, I think there's two components of it. One relates to cyber risk in general, and the other just relates to the ability for DoD to have the things it needs and to have them where they need them at the time they're required. And any impact on the supply chain from the lowest level up to the level of the contractor has a direct impact in being able to ensure what is available, when it's needed, and where it's needed. The other component is with respect to just cybersecurity. Alan Lord referred to suppliers as kind of the weak underbelly of the supply chain. And if an organization, if a bad actor, a nation state were looking at some way of being able to affect the resilience of the supply chain to the Department of Defense, where would you look? Where would you look at a prime who is heavily fortified defenses, or would you look towards the bottom of the supply chain, the weakest part of the supply chain that could potentially be affected and interrupted in providing those goods and services at the top of the supply chain? And also, when we look at things that level 4 and level 5 of CMMC are intended to address, like advanced persistent threats, if I want to interject some type of a threat, am I going to try at the highest level, or am I going to try at a lower level and to try to escalate, that threat, of course? And a lot of history of that. When we look at OMB, we look at the Target attack, all of these that are pretty legendary at that point. They really started with somebody starting at a lower part of that supply chain and ultimately being able to reach the highest level of that supply chain.
Right, but to your point about availability and the impact to the supply chain as a whole. So the malicious cyber actors are going after the weakest link, like the small suppliers. But the impact of the CMMC and this NIST requirement on those small suppliers is going to have the same effect as if they're targeted by our adversaries, right? The lack of availability of that resource. So if they've decided that the CMMC is going to price them out of the market, that's just as dangerous to national security as them being a sitting duck for our adversaries. So to talk about some of the budgets of these small companies, and I have some of the numbers here that I want to reference. So the Small Business Administration defines a small business as having less than 100 employees and a revenue of less than $50 million. And they say that 99.7% of all U.S. businesses fall into this category. Now, we're not really sure if the DOD supply chain fits that same demographic, but it's probably not too far off, at least the U.S.-based companies. So how can a small company with an average IT budget of 3.28%, according to the Small Business Administration, how can they possibly afford these types of defenses to defend against these malicious cyber actors who do nothing but target them? They're trying to supply stuff to the Department of Defense, and here's this malicious cyber actor probably funded by a nation state, because I'm sure most hackers aren't these teenagers sitting in their mom's basement. They're probably state-funded actors targeting these weak points. So how can they possibly defend against that?
Well, I think you really put your finger on a key part. It's not just the impact of being attacked by a foreign actor, but the burden on small suppliers then to put in place the defenses that are required to really protect themselves against those attacks. And CMMC it's an incredibly important initiative. It addresses an issue that really is central to national security, but at the same time, it's posing the potential risk that an organization that is vital to some program, to some project, may simply look and say, the cost of being able to support CMMC certification from a business standpoint isn't worth it. We're either going to focus on our commercial business, or potentially, we may do something else. And so that's a real dire consequence that needs to be considered. And some of it is just looking at the model that has evolved. The analogies between the physical and the virtual kind of fall apart very quickly. But if you look at physical security, versus cyber security, the protection that an organization, any business has against nation state actors, against foreign adversaries, is funded by the government. We all pay for it proportionately as a function of the taxes that we pay. Small businesses pay their fair share as a percentage. Bigger businesses pay their fair share as a percentage. And the government is then providing the security that is needed against a kinetic attack that may affect those organizations in some form or other. And in fact, the ability to project force to defend ourselves, or all of those things that ensure that those events are not happening. But when we move to cyber, it becomes a very different situation. And again, we're looking at attacks from nation state actors, from foreign adversaries. But yet, rather than looking and saying, gee, why don't we find a way to proportionately share the cost and have the government then come in and provide support for the overall solution. We're asking each individual organization to be able to pay to defend its own perimeter, its own boundary. Maybe again another bad analogy, but it would almost be like asking every single business to be able to to form its own militia to be able to physically protect itself. And so again, the analogies may not quite hold, but when we look at just in terms of who's bearing the burden relative to ensuring that the security of the nation is protected, the model is very different when we look at physical or kinetic attacks versus looking at cyber attacks.
No, I totally agree. So would you advocate for maybe just initially the supply chain? Would you advocate for DOD covering a portion of that cost of cybersecurity? DOD has been messaging that, cybersecurity can be an allowable expense in some contracts, but that means you have to allocate that expense to each contract. But if, they're a hybrid supplier and they have a commercial business and also service the Defense Department, how do they allocate that appropriately? Do you think there would be an appetite or some way for DOD to cover, maybe just for its supply chain, the cost of cyber?
I think the DoD is working through a lot of problems and a lot of issues. And I think first and foremost, DoD deserves a huge amount of credit for this initiative because it's a problem that can't go unsolved. And certainly the things that are being put in place will have flaws, they'll be fixed. I think this is part of the crawl, walk, run that we hear Katie Arrington talk about frequently. And so a lot of I think the hard spots are going to become more apparent as we get through it. But I think the net becomes the need to really look at a different way to not just fund security, but also perhaps how to deliver security. A lot of the security tools that exist today, the security frameworks, it really evolved around a different concept of the infrastructure of an organization, of what the perimeter looked like, and built for a kind of perimeter-based. Let me step back. Deep breath. Okay.
You're getting kind of into the zero trust framework, right?
Right.
Because before the construct was perimeter based, but if everything is zero trust, then it doesn't really matter perimeters because it's zero trust, and you have to authenticate to allow access, right?
Well, there's different ways of doing zero trust, but I think the point being that the security models that are in place, the way that organizations are implementing cybersecurity, even the products that are largely exist in the market today, were built for a perimeter that no longer exists. There no longer, do you find a company that has every asset in a data center where you can lock and close the door. Now it's distributed between many data centers, many physical locations, across private cloud, across public cloud. I forget the number of individual public cloud and private cloud instances that the typical enterprise has today, but they're in the dozens in both of those cases. And the notion of a perimeter, it really is no longer valid. And what we're seeing evolve, as you mentioned, is the development of zero trust solutions. Instead of firm perimeters, we have software-defined perimeters. Rather than the enterprise being the perimeter, the individual becomes the perimeter, and an individual perimeter for each person based on those things that they are entitled to access. And just as we're now starting to rethink how we build secure infrastructure rather than secure the infrastructure that is there, a lot of thought needs to be given both to how we provide cybersecurity for all businesses across the defense industrial base, as well as how we pay for that security.
Yeah. So, what is your advice to these small businesses that they have their cybersecurity budget is $100,000? Okay, here we go. You're a small business, you have 50 employees, and you have $100,000 for cybersecurity. How do you allocate those funds to get the most bang for your buck?
Yeah, I think it's a different answer for every single organization, and it's depending on where they stand today relative to security. There are some small businesses that have been prudent, that have built their IT infrastructure with security in mind. There are others that have just kind of evolved, and security has been an afterthought, or how do we add security to it? It's kind of like asking how long is a piece of string. For different organizations, the answer is going to be different. But I think for those that truly are critical to the supply chain, to the DoD, alternatives need to be looked at. And I know that organizations within the DIB, the primes, are looking at alternative means for some of these small organizations to operate, to be able to provide them their own laptops or provide them VDIs to operate within their own infrastructure. And I think we're, again, starting to see creative solutions that are enabling these small organizations to operate securely and to operate in a means that they can be certified under CMMC at the appropriate levels. But it is a dilemma. And I think there's a component that is related to it that perhaps hasn't been part of the discussion, and that's innovation. A lot of innovation is brought to the defense industrial base from small organizations and organizations that have worked within within other sectors. I know early on in my career, I worked for an organization that was developing solutions for the public safety market, and it developed some unique location and dispatching technology. We became aware of a procurement from, at that time, it was the Border Patrol, and responded to a solicitation and ended up with an award where we provided some vital technology that had a big impact on securing portions of the southern border. Subsequently, that technology was rolled out across the entire southern border. But if I think back and say, gee, there's a set of requirements that we're going to need to be able to comply with in order to even respond or to be considered, we may not have even considered going after that particular opportunity, which again ultimately benefited the government, certainly benefited the company and the contract that we received in exchange. But to what extent, could this burden threaten or kind of scare small organizations who could bring innovative solutions to the government and kind of scare them away from offering those solutions?
I totally agree. And not just scare them off from entering, but have them exit the market. And not just like, yes, we need the innovation, but we also need the manufacturing base. We need all of these small businesses because they're so critical to the DoD supply chain.
But and absolutely, and some of them have developed, or maybe not developed, have retained skills that are being lost. The ability to machine certain parts to certain tolerances, unique components that go in an engine for a ship or on another platform. So this is not kind of commodity manufacturing where I can go out and find a number 4 Phillips screw anywhere, but I need to be able to find an organization that has had this know-how and knowledge and has passed it down. And if it elects to exit because it can no longer afford to operate within the defense industrial base, the impact on national defense, can certainly be very, very clearly felt. The cost of cybersecurity, it doesn't scale. There are some things that scale on an individual or an endpoint by endpoint basis, but by and large, the services that a small organization needs to implement a set of security controls are roughly equivalent to the same set of services that a large organization is going to need to implement that same set of security controls. The difference is the larger company is going to have a broader base to be able to amortize or defray those costs against. And similarly, when we look at security products, and for a number of years, I had been with companies that were building cybersecurity software tools, both software and hardware tools. The focus has always been on how do you address the needs of the largest companies? How do you address the needs of those companies that are in regulated industries? And at the end of the process, those products tend not to scale and address the needs of the smaller organizations. Yeah, there are some that are doing that. But again, I look at endpoint software. I can buy endpoint software on a per person basis. But if I need something like network monitoring and need to go to buy something to do continuous monitoring from somebody like Tenable, the minimum entry level is $2,900, independent of whether I've got 50 people or 500 people on a network. that I'm monitoring.
Yeah, I definitely, speaking of innovation, I definitely look forward to see how the defense industrial base as a whole and the service provider, how they come together to figure out this problem, right? Because this is kind of an unfixable solution, or appears that way right now. But I have no doubt that the innovation in our country and in our supply chain can somehow figure this out. And I know they'll figure this out. And so I really look forward to seeing what the solution is, whether it's a like a buy-in market, like you buy in as a small business to a larger enterprise solution that's only available to, a certain amount of endpoints, whatever the solution is. I think it'll be really creative, and I have no doubt that we'll figure it out. But right now it just seems like this insurmountable problem that a lot of companies are facing and soon will have to be assessed against, right? Like, the DoD doesn't care that you have this problem. They want you to fix it, and they want you to fix it right now.
Absolutely. And I agree with you, and I disagree with you. I don't think it's insurmountable. I believe that the motivation, both of the majority of companies within the defense industrial base and the government, is the same. Having again had the privilege of working at ExoStar and with a number of these organizations, there's a great deal of patriotism and motivation. And I think the commitment to figuring this out is there. Yeah, it's going to take some time, and it's not going to be easy. But ultimately, different approaches to solving this problem, from how do we pay for it to really how do we deliver security. So stay tuned. I think that a lot will evolve. We'll see a lot of changes over the next several years. But the good news is CMMC is just a huge leap towards better securing the supply chain. And I think, a step that a lot of people deserve to be applauded for, from the CMMC PMO within the DoD to certainly those within the accreditation body that have really volunteered to bring us to where we are today and to get to the point where we see the interim rule going into effect.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise in the supply chain, specifically the supply chain area. I think there's a ton of cybersecurity professionals with expertise, but I think you have a very unique background to speak about supply chain, and that's what this episode is all about. It's about our smallest suppliers that really comprise the entire supply. The majority of the supply chain are those small businesses, and they're so critical. So I thank you so much for your time, Stuart. And we should circle back again in 6 months or a year and see how industry has really solved this problem, because I think they will have solved for X by then.
Absolutely. And the only question I have is, how much did the Pentagon buy on Small Business Saturday?
We should send an official RFI to the DoD.
Leslie, thanks very much. And again, I think this is a great platform, and appreciate the opportunity to participate.
Thank you so much.
So I am new to the defense industry on the corporate side. I retired on September 30th after 37 years in the Army as a general officer. Yeah.
Just now?
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Congratulations.
Yeah, thanks. Sure. My last assignment, I was a division commander. And in fact, I had Task Force 76, which during the COVID pandemic was reflagged as Task Force West. And we had all the Western states and the 3 Western FEMA regions. And I spent the whole first part of the COVID pandemic out in Seattle, setting up the field hospitals out there, and also making plans to do the same in California and Colorado. So my retirement was actually delayed several times because of that. And I finally left the Army on September 30th and went to work full-time for Monterey Technologies as their Director of Engineering Services.
Wow. Okay. So what do they do briefly for the defense, or what do they do for DoD?
Yeah. So Monterey Technologies is a 37-year-old veteran-owned small business. We started in Monterey, California, which is how we got the name that we have now. However, the owners moved the headquarters here to Park City, Utah, about 5 years ago, and the company's been here ever since. Although our employees, and this is key because it's how our infrastructure is set up, have long before COVID almost exclusively worked from home. We do have a few that work in customer offices, particularly like in the Navy Spay Wharf Diego, but most of our employees do work straight from their house with a company laptop through a VPN.
Okay.
The company specializes in human factors engineering, modeling and simulation, and command and control systems.
Okay, so does the DOD, when you perform work for the DOD, do they send you information that's marked CUI? Well, it's probably not something we should talk about because everyone's big on OPSEC. But
to date, we have never gotten a document with any CUI markings. And in fact, had we done this a week ago, I would tell you we have never seen it in any of the clauses of any of our contracts. Last week was the first time in one of our primes had it as a clause, as a flow down clause. And so I immediately actually raised a red flag, said, hey, although my NIST score's in, we did that in advance. For NIST, though, I mean, although we don't, you could have a huge negative number and be fine. You just have to have a score, and we did that. And we're working through it. Our goal is to be CMMC 3 compliant. Our goal is to shoot for March 31st, so the end of the first quarter, calendar year 21. That's a stretch goal for us. But when we saw this come down in this flow down, we immediately called them and said, hey, we're a little concerned because we don't meet all of these criteria today. And we're already executing on this contract. In fact, we had started, the government wanted this thing moving so quickly that we started with a letter of authorization to proceed and then got the contract almost 60 days into it. And that's when we saw this. And the prime actually came back and said, be honest with you, we're not 100% sure what the impact of that clause is anyway. And we're not sure that we meet 100% of all of that at this point.
So how is that supposed to be helpful? That seems way more confusing than helpful. And there's your problem.
You're right. So this is exactly the problem that I think a lot of the small businesses are having. If our big primes who do have big IT shops, and many of them have lobbying arms and they work with the government every day, we don't have those capabilities. If they're not 100% sure what all this means yet, how is it that we're going to get there? And, let me add one more piece in there that's a little bit tricky. So we have an ExoStar account, and 2 of our big primes use that. And so I had to go in and I had to fill out the survey for them. And it's all built based on the NIST standards, but their survey was not exactly the same. And the scoring isn't the same. So I got a score in ExoStar for what my primes were looking for, but it's all positive numbers, and it doesn't relate in any way to the score that I loaded into SPRS sometime. In fact, I've done an update to SPRS. So we did an initial one about a month ago. One of the first things I did when I got here is I went through to figure out where we were, and I put in a negative number. And then just before November 30th, I updated it with where we are now. But it's this confusion that we're running into, and I am not a computer guy.
That's what I was going to ask you. I was going to say, how did you answer this survey? How? I mean, like, literally, did you have to go research what these terms meant? Did you engage? I mean, how much time did it actually take you to do this?
Yeah, so that is the exact problem that we're facing, is that I probably have spent between 15 to 50 hours a week doing nothing but cybersecurity, because most of it is me having to learn and study. And so often when I call like our service provider, as I mentioned, we have no IT infrastructure with the exception of our laptops and some printers. I have to call them. I've sent questions to NDIA. I've sent questions up through you guys. And what I often get back, the answer is, well, it depends, because there's all these interrelated systems. So I'll say, hey, are we compliant with this item, whatever it happens to be? And what I'll get back from my service provider is, well, it depends. You are when you're doing this, and if you have that. But if you are on this other position, or you're not going through the VPN because you're operating here, and we only give you a static IP address when you absolutely need it for getting onto certain networks, otherwise you bypass it. We didn't know that. We thought we were on VPNs constantly, but that's not how they set it up because of the bandwidth problem. So every time I find a spot, I get to another question. I'm trying to set up, I spent yesterday trying to do a tutorial, if you will, on the Microsoft Endpoint Manager to try to put in all the controls I need for people working on their personal cell phones. For instance, I have mine right here, and this is my personal cell phone, and I can get to Microsoft Office 365, but there are basically no controls between that and our service provider. I shouldn't say no controls. We did put in MFA right away, so I have multi-factor authentication, but we have nothing else in there. So any of my employees could log on with their personal iPhone, Android, personal laptop, just go to Office 365 and in you go.
So do you guys have policies that align with the NIST framework, or are you also working on those as you go along?
Yes. So we're working on we have some policies in place. And I think we had some of the key ones in place, but they're certainly not spelled out in anywhere near the depth that we need. In fact, we're now working with an online service to help us rewrite all of our policies. Because there are some tools out there that help to evaluate, hey, did you hit all the key should in the policy? Our entire employee policy handbook is where everything fits, and the whole thing's only about 20 pages long. And it's been sufficient for years and years.
Right. But to that point, and this is some free consulting advice, so it's worth what you pay for it. But in the future, once you put all your policies in place, you should make your employees sign an AUP, an acceptable use policy, where you spell out these policies and make them sign it. So if they violate it, then you can proceed with administrative actions or whatever the punishments might be, because I anticipate a lot where some of your controls will be enforced via policy. Like if you tell them that they can't access CUI from their cell phone or from their personal email and they do it anyway, you need to make sure that they sign, that they acknowledge it, and then being able to hold them accountable in case they don't. So, okay. So you were an extremely high-ranking military officer, and now you've come into this company and you're in charge of leading this NIST compliance and also the CMMC compliance, which means you're not doing other things for this company that they brought you in to do. So between your opportunity cost of what you're not doing for your company and the time that you've spent doing this, what do you think, just in the human hours, the cost to your company to do this truly is? Because the interim rule says that it should only take you 30 minutes to do this.
Yeah, so I read that, and I was wondering just how brilliant that person was that they based it on, because that certainly is not me. So as I said, I have spent at least 15 hours a week for the last month or month and a half, maybe a little bit more. I did ask our CEO how much time he put into it in the year leading up, year and a half. So he started this really in late 2017 and in early 2018 in earnest, trying to attack this. I should point out, we only had, before I got here, 4 employees that were not exclusively direct charge employees, right? One's our accountant, so he's swamped. This is what he does every day. We have a contracts guy who is also our security person, so he does all of our JPass and that sort of stuff. And then we have someone who handles all the office operations and those kinds of things. And we have a BD person, plus the CEO. And then I was supposed to be about 25-75 between direct charge and indirect. As it turns out, I'm almost all indirect, because about the time I came on is when everyone was realizing, hey, we're really behind the power curve. We need to get after this. But our CEO told me that since late 2017, our company had already spent about $100,000 between either manpower hours or upgrading some of our licenses. So we didn't have a high enough level of Office 365 license. In fact, I just found out that in order to get the CMMC template in the compliance manager, you have to have an Echo 5 license or higher, and you have to still pay extra. It's still not standard. The NIST is with the Echo 5, CMMC is not. So in order for me to get access to that, we're going to have to pay that. And I actually am waiting to get a cost from our service provider on what that upgrade is going to cost. So we're already $100,000 into this and hundreds of hours. My guess is over the next, between now and March 31st, when I hope to get us complete and all the policies written. By the way, I'm not writing all those myself, but my guess is we'll spend another $40,000 to $50,000.
So, and what's your maintenance plan, right? Like, this is not a set it and forget it thing, unfortunately. Right. So you're going to have to tee this up so that somebody can manage it. So how do you plan to manage it going forward?
Yeah, so we've had some discussions already with our current service provider, who, by the way, they've been fantastic to us over the last many years that they've been working with us, but they are not primarily a government service provider. I don't know how many government clients they have, but I don't think it's that many. And so we're not even sure we can stay with them because they may not be able to do this work. So I'm not sure anyone looked at how many of these kind of people are going to lose their business over this, right? So, well, not their whole business, but their government side of it. So if we have to switch, there's probably a cost to that. And we have already talked to several companies that provide this as a service ongoing. And their costs run anywhere from about $7,000 to $10,000 for initial assessments. And then we've seen up as high as $12,000 to $15,000 a month to stay on top of it. Now, we're a smaller company. I don't think that ours will cost that much. But what we keep getting is after we do the assessment, then we could tell you what your monthly is going to be. My guess is we will probably have to hire somebody, either an ISP that knows how to do this for us, because in essence, they handle all of our infrastructure. And then we'll have to work with them on our policies and keep those updated, or hire a third company to come in on top of them and to monitor the whole thing. And it's probably going to cost a company like us between $3,000 to $5,000 a month.
Yeah, I would agree, which is crazy. I actually do some part-time consulting work for a managed security service provider here in the DC area. And, I give them 10 hours a month. But what I do is I answer these like nuanced questions for their clients. And they have a lot of defense contractors. And they're like, hey, if they have GCC high, does this get them this compliance or that compliance? And I'm like, yep, it meets this, this, and this. But these companies, if they're not compliance experts, they're cybersecurity experts. And so they're having to outsource their work to make it look like they're in-housing that expertise. So, I don't know what this shakes out and looks like in the end, right? Like, will there be these merge type companies where MSSPs become compliance experts because they have to in order to survive, or companies like the one you have now that primarily don't service defense contractors. However, there is, the rest of the federal government is looking at the NIST 800-171. Well, CUI is a federal program, right? And so they're looking at building into the FAR, the NIST 800-171 requirement for all of the federal contractors. So it's simply a matter of time before this is the standard. So it would behoove these service providers to understand compliance for federal contractors. But it's not now.
That'll take care of the NIST part of it. But will the CMMC, will that apply to the rest of the federal government? And if it doesn't, then how do we handle where we charge this expense? Because if I put it at overhead, then it's not fair to NASA or my commercial clients that my overhead is up and they're paying that price. And if not, is there a way to allocate a portion of it against a direct charge to a contract that puts it in that has the clause in it? These are all the questions that we just can't answer yet, and we don't know the answer. And quite honestly, in all the discussion groups I'm on, I don't know that anyone really knows the answer to that yet and where we're authorized to charge this.
That is a very good point. I'm so glad you brought that up. And I don't know if that's in. Yeah, that's not. No, that's an excellent point to bring up. I'm very glad. So I've had you for almost 20 minutes. But I think you've hit some of the most important points I wanted to hit in this conversation. So unless you have some other points you want to bring up, I think this was a really productive conversation. And whomever watches this is either going to say, yeah, I know, me too. Or they're going to say, oh my gosh, like we had no idea, we need to fix this. Yeah. So before we leave, is there anything else you'd like to bring to everyone's attention? Like I really want the transition team and the new administration to really listen to these stories, because it's not just one person saying that I'm having an issue because I haven't been compliant, so I'm complaining because now I have to be compliant. But I think you guys represent a really standard case of people trying to do the right thing. So the floor is yours to present any information.
I really don't think I have anything else, because the problem is if I talk anymore, people will realize just how shallow my knowledge is on this. Because like all these small companies, unless this is their business, we just don't have anyone who is an expert either in compliance issues or in cybersecurity or even basic IT. I mean, I basically got it because a long, long time ago, I did some computer programming, but I won't even tell you. I think my last computer programming class was in 1984.
Okay, that was the year I was born, so
There you go. And
36
no one
years
had
ago.
thought about this.